tarps now. Nobody gets a clear shot. Careful with that console, it's still active.
Hi guys, thank you so much for joining me on the channel today. I'm Ted Yakuji, and I'm so excited because this is the very first video that I'm making on my new YouTube channel called the Cool Topics channel. Now, if you've seen me on any of my other videos on my other channel, the Ted Yakuji channel, you know that we deal with some pretty serious subjects, and mostly about U.S. history and the JFK assassination. So it's so cool for me to have this new channel where I can go ahead and really explore all the other things in the world that I want to talk about besides that. And that is something that I care very much about. But we can have some fun, and we can also learn a whole lot on this channel. So thank you for being some of the very first people to tune in to the Cool Topics channel. If I might ask you a favor right away, if you wouldn't mind being some of the first people to subscribe to the channel, I would really appreciate it. You may know that you have to get to a certain level of subscribers before you really get put in the algorithm for YouTube to be as disseminated, have your videos shared as widely as they possibly can. So if you would hit that subscribe button, I would really appreciate it. Thank you. All right, so what are we going to be talking about in our first video on the Cool Topics channel? Well, I thought we'd have some real fun and talk about what we might consider to be the top 5 sightings or top 5 encounters with UFOs in America. So I've been wanting to be able to explore some topics that we can be really creative and have some fun with, and really kind of delve into it and use some of the same methodology that we use with some of our serious topics on the other channel, but really be able to kind of just, again, have some fun. So I thought we'd look at the top 5 sightings, or at least 5 of the top sightings of UFOs or encounters with UFOs that have taken place in America. And I thought we would start with number 5, and that would be what I consider to be one of the most interesting abduction stories concerning UFOs. And that took place in a little town called Pascagoula, Mississippi, the eastern side of Mississippi, down near the Gulf of Mexico. It involves 2 men, a 45-year-old man and a 17-year-old man, who were related, and they also worked together, and they just decided to do a little evening fishing on the banks of the Pascagoula River. And what happened next, I find absolutely incredible, and they stuck to their story all of their lives, and both of them have passed on now, but they stuck to their story for their entire lives. And we'll all have to make up our own minds about all of these stories, but let's get into it and examine the Pascagoula UFO incident. On the evening of October 11th, 1973, on the banks of the Pascagoula River in Mississippi, 2 men experienced something that would not only change their lives forever, but would also become one of the most intriguing and debated UFO cases in American history. It was a calm Thursday night. 45-year-old Charles Hickson and 17-year-old Calvin Parker, co-workers at the local shipyard, had decided to spend the evening fishing after work. The river was quiet, the air thick with the sounds of southern wildlife. As dusk faded, the men settled in for a few hours of fishing and relaxation. Then the routine was shattered by the arrival of something wholly unexpected. Shortly after 9 p.m., Hickson and Parker, spotted a strange glowing object descending from the sky. It hovered silently above the water, shaped like an oval and emitting blue lights. What happened next would haunt them for the rest of their lives. According to the men, a hatch opened on the craft, and 3 humanoid creatures emerged. The beings, described as pale-skinned with wrinkled bodies, claw-like hands, and conical heads, floated towards the men. Paralyzed by fear, Hickson and Parker reported being taken aboard the craft, examined, and then later returned to the riverbank, dazed and terrified. Hickson would go on to give even more detail about the incident. Hickson claimed that 3 creatures with pincers, crab-like pincers, took them aboard the object and subjected them to an examination before returning them to the wharf. The pair continued on to the sheriff's office to make a report. During the officer's examination, they actually left Hickson and Parker alone in a room, secretly recording the conversation between the two, hoping to catch them in a lie. But their stories remained consistent with their original testimony. The next day, on October 12, 1973, the Mississippi Press of Pascagoula reported on the 2 men who claimed to have been taken on board a UFO by strange creatures the previous night. The men were examined at Keesler Air Force Base, cleared of radiation exposure, and released. By October 31st, press reported that a local polygraph examiner had concluded Hickson told the truth as to what he believed during a lie detector test. The Pascagoula incident remains a cornerstone of UFO lore. Skeptics have offered alternate explanations, citing stress or hallucination, and supporters point to the men's consistent testimony and lack of a motive for a hoax. Over years, new witnesses and evidence have surfaced, fueling ongoing discussion among believers and doubters alike. Whether fact, fiction, or something in between, the Pascagoula UFO encounter stands as a compelling mystery. It invites us to ponder the unknown and reminds us that sometimes the most extraordinary stories happen in the most ordinary places. All right, so that's really interesting what happened to those 2 men in Pascagoula, Mississippi. But now we move to a UFO sighting that is really much more well known. And that's what happened in Kecksburg, Pennsylvania. Now, you probably have heard the story sometime over the years of the UFO incident in Kecksburg. And what I find interesting about that whole encounter or that whole sighting is that people tend to fall really on one side or another. And there's a lot of really sharp interaction between the believers and the non-believers. So let's talk about Kecksburg. And first of all, let's talk about what we know happened on that night back in 1965.
Those tarps now. Nobody gets a clear shot. Careful with that console, it's still active.
On the evening of December 9th, 1965, as winter darkness settled over the rolling hills of Pennsylvania, thousands of people across North America looked up and saw something they could not explain. A brilliant fireball streaked across the sky. Witnesses from Canada to Michigan, from Ohio to Pennsylvania, reported an object blazing through the atmosphere. Some described it as a meteor. Others said it maneuvered. Many insisted it slowed and changed direction. And then near the small town of Kecksburg, Pennsylvania, the object came down. What happened next would become one of the most enduring and controversial UFO cases in American history. Residents of Kecksburg heard a loud crash echo through the woods just outside town. Farmers and volunteers grabbed flashlights and headed towards the impact site. What they found, or at least claimed to find, was no ordinary wreckage. Several witnesses described a metallic object, roughly the size of a small car, acorn, or bell-shaped, partially buried in the ground. It appeared smooth and seamless, bronze or copper in color. Most unsettling of all were the markings. Symbols, described as hieroglyphic-like, resembling ancient writing, were reportedly etched along the surface. But before anyone could get close, authorities arrived. First came local police, then state troopers, and soon after, military personnel sealed off the area. Witnesses say armed soldiers ordered civilians to leave. Roads were blocked. The object was reportedly loaded onto a flatbed truck and driven away under military escort. Destination unknown. By morning, the story changed. Officials announced the object was nothing more than a meteorite, or possibly debris from a Soviet satellite. Case closed. Except it wasn't. But records showed that object burned up in the atmosphere days earlier. Witnesses stood by their accounts. Over the years, investigators uncovered contradictory military reports, missing documentation, and alleged intimidation of locals who spoke out. In 2005, NASA admitted it had lost key files related to the incident. Lost or removed? Today, Kecksburg embraces its mystery. A small memorial stands near the alleged crash site. An annual UFO festival draws visitors from around the world. And the question still lingers in the cold Pennsylvania air. What really fell from the sky that night in 1965? Was it a misidentified space object? A classified military experiment? Or something not of this world? Nearly 60 years later, the truth remains buried, somewhere between official explanations and eyewitness testimony. And until it is uncovered, the Kecksburg UFO incident remains one of America's most compelling unsolved mysteries. So I always find the Kecksburg UFO incident a lot of fun. If you've ever talked to anybody from that area, you'll know that there's no in-between ground. People either really believe it or they really don't believe it. It's kind of interesting. I've had the pleasure of talking to several people from that area, and the beliefs are very strong. I'll put it that way. All right, from Kecksburg, Pennsylvania, we move west to Arizona, 1975. Just about everybody knows who Travis Walton is, and there was the movie later starring Jim Garner, Fire in the Sky, which drew a lot of interest. But again, we're talking about the Travis Walton UFO abduction that happened near Snowflake, Arizona. Let's take a look. On November 5th, 1975, as daylight faded over the dense pine forests near Snowflake, Arizona, 7 men wrapped up what should have been an ordinary day of logging. Deadlines were tight, tempers were frayed, and none of them suspected that before the night was over, their lives and reputations would be changed forever. As they drove along a remote forest road, a strange glow appeared through the trees. Hovering above the ground was a bright, disc-shaped object, radiating a bluish-green light. The men slowed their truck, unsure whether they were seeing a helicopter, a fire, or something else entirely. Against the protests of his co-workers, Travis Walton, just 22 years old, stepped out of the vehicle and approached the object. Then, without warning, a brilliant beam of energy struck him, lifting him off the ground and throwing him backwards. The other men, terrified, believed Walton had been killed. They fled. Minutes later, when they returned to the site, Walton was gone. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no damaged equipment, only silence. The following morning, authorities launched a massive missing person investigation. Almost immediately, suspicion turned toward the 6 remaining men. In rural Arizona in the 1970s, disappearances often ended badly. Each man underwent polygraph testing, not once, but multiple times. All 6 passed. The result did not prove their innocence, but it certainly complicated the investigation. Days passed. Search parties combed the forest. The story made national headlines. Public opinion hardened. Many believed Walton was dead. Then, on the 5th day, Travis Walton reappeared. Disoriented, dehydrated, and emotionally shaken, he was found near a telephone booth in Heber, Arizona, miles from where he vanished. He claimed he had been abducted. According to Walton, he awoke aboard a craft unlike anything he had seen before. He described smooth metallic walls, a cold, sterile environment, and small beings with large eyes, figures now commonly associated with the gray alien archetype. Frightened, Walton said he struggled, grabbing a tool and striking one of the beings. He then claimed to encounter taller, human-like figures who escorted him to another area of the craft. Shortly after, he lost consciousness. When he awoke again, he was back on Earth. Once again, polygraph tests were administered. Walton passed, but skepticism remained. Critics quickly raised questions. Polygraph tests, they pointed out, are not definitive proof of truth, especially in emotionally charged cases. Others suggested the event may have been an elaborate hoax, possibly motivated by financial incentives or publicity. There were also inconsistencies between Walton's earliest statements and his later retellings, particularly after the release of the 1993 film Fire in the Sky, which dramatized and altered several details. Walton himself has stated the film exaggerated his experience. Medical examinations revealed no clear evidence of trauma, radiation exposure, or prolonged captivity. And yet, for nearly 50 years, Travis Walton has never changed his story. The 6 men who witnessed the initial event have maintained their accounts, despite ridicule, scrutiny, and little financial gain. No one ever confessed to a hoax. Was the Travis Walton abduction an extraordinary encounter with non-human intelligence? A rare psychological event shared by multiple witnesses? Or a perfectly sustained fabrication that has endured for decades? The truth remains elusive, caught between belief and disbelief, testimony and skepticism. And like many cases involving unexplained phenomena, The Travis Walton abduction ultimately reveals as much about human perception and belief as it does about what may or may not exist beyond our world. I find the Travis Walton abduction case really, really interesting. I've had a hard time over the years disbelieving him. Every time I listen to an interview with him, especially an in-depth interview, I have to say he comes across really believable. So, you have to think that something happened to him, whether it was an alien abduction or, whether it was some kind of a psychological crisis, whatever. An event seems to have happened to Travis Walton. So I find that really, really interesting. All right, now we go to the second most popular American sighting, and it's an abduction. And it was really the first abduction case. We have to go way back to 1961. And if you're a kind of a UFO enthusiast, you'll certainly know the story of Betty and Barney Hill, who were coming back from a vacation in Canada, driving through New Hampshire, and lost a couple of hours of time. And when they went back and thought about it later that night, really got scared more than anything else. So here is the story, the very, very interesting story of Barney and Betty Hill. On the night of September 19th, 1961, an ordinary drive home became the beginning of one of the most famous and debated UFO cases in history. Betty and Barney Hill were returning to their home in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, after a vacation in Canada. The road was dark and quiet as they traveled through the White Mountains, just south of Lancaster, New Hampshire. Then Betty noticed something unusual in the sky, a bright light. At first it appeared to be a star, until it moved. The object seemed to change direction, growing larger as it followed their car. Curious and uneasy, Barney pulled over. Using binoculars, he observed what he later described as a disc-shaped craft, rotating and silent. Then came the moment that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Barney claimed he saw figures through the craft's windows, figures that appeared to be looking back at him. Terrified, he ran to the car and sped away. Soon after, the Hills heard a series of rhythmic beeping or buzzing sounds. When the sounds stopped, they found themselves farther down the road, with nearly 2 hours missing from their journey. Neither could explain how they got there. When they arrived home, both felt shaken and unwell. Betty's dress was torn. Barney's shoes were scuffed. Their watches had stopped. In the days that followed, strange symptoms emerged. Betty began having vivid nightmares involving small beings, medical examinations, and a star map. Barney suffered from anxiety, insomnia, and recurring fear. Eventually, seeking answers, the Hills turned to medical professionals. Under hypnosis, conducted by psychiatrist Dr. Benjamin Simon, Betty and Barney separately recalled being taken aboard a craft by non-human beings. They described similar procedures, medical exams, bright lights, and communication that seemed telepathic rather than spoken. Barney's sessions were especially intense. He relived the experience with visible fear and emotional distress. The accounts were remarkably consistent, despite the sessions being conducted independently. The story went public in 1965. It became the first widely publicized alien abduction case in American history. Critics pointed out that hypnosis can be highly suggestible, capable of creating detailed false memories, especially when reinforced by dreams, stress, or cultural influences. Barney's description of the beings' faces closely resembled characters from a popular television episode of The Outer Limits that aired shortly before his hypnosis sessions. Astronomers suggested the object the Hills initially saw may have been Venus. Others proposed that the missing time could be explained by fatigue, highway hypnosis, or stress after a long drive. Still, some details resist easy explanation. Betty later drew a star map she said was shown to her by one of the beings. Years later, an amateur astronomer claimed it roughly matched the Zeta Reticuli star system, though professionals strongly dispute that interpretation. And Dr. Simon, a skeptic himself, concluded that the Hills genuinely believed their experience, even if its origin was psychological rather than extraterrestrial. Betty Hill remained convinced of the reality of the abduction until her death in 2004. Barney, who died in 1969, never fully recovered with what he experienced. He believed something extraordinary had happened, but struggled with fear and doubt for the rest of his life. Were Betty and Barney Hill victims of an alien encounter, or pioneers of a modern myth, born from stress, expectation, and the mysteries of the human mind? The Hills experience sits at the foundation of UFO lore, not because it offers clear answers, but because it asks enduring questions about memory, about belief, and about how humans confront the unknown when science has yet to catch up. More than 60 years later, the road through the White Mountains remains unchanged. But what happened there that night is still up for debate. So again, as abduction cases go, it's tough to beat the Barney and Betty Hill case. I remember my parents being interested in that and watching interviews with Barney and Betty Hill on television shows, when I was, 10 years old or so. So really interesting case. Now we move, of course, to number one. Number one, there can only really be number one, and everyone knows that's got to be Roswell. 1947, Mac Brazel finds the wreckage of what would come to be known as a wrecked alien spacecraft. The U.S. government put out several explanations of the story over the years and decades. And of course, it's really up to everyone to make up their own minds about what happened in Roswell. Here is that story. In the summer of 1947, the world was changing. World War II had ended, the Cold War had begun, rockets, radar, and nuclear weapons were reshaping humanity's understanding of technology and fear. It was in this tense atmosphere that a strange discovery in the desert outside Roswell, New Mexico, would become the most famous UFO incident in history. In early July, rancher William Mac Brazel found unusual debris scattered across his property near Corona, New Mexico. The fragments were unlike anything he had seen before, lightweight, metallic, and strangely resilient. Unsure what he had found, Brazel contacted local authorities. Soon the debris reached the Roswell Army Airfield, home of the U.S. military's only nuclear-capable bomber group. What happened next made headlines around the world. On July 8, 1947, the Roswell Army Airfield issued a startling press release. The many rumors regarding the flying disc became a reality yesterday when the Intelligence Office of the 509th Bomb Group recovered a flying disc. For the first and only time, the U.S. military publicly announced it had captured a flying saucer. By the next day, the story changed. Military officials now claim the debris was simply a weather balloon. Newspapers printed photographs of officers posing with foil, sticks, and rubber. The incident was declared closed. But questions lingered. Why would an elite military base mistake a weather balloon for a flying disc? Why issue such a dramatic statement, only to retract it within hours? And why did the story refuse to disappear? For decades, Roswell faded into obscurity. Then, in the late 1970s, new voices emerged. Former military personnel and civilians began claiming the crash involved an extraterrestrial craft and that the government had covered it up. Some alleged there were multiple crash sites. Others claimed alien bodies were recovered. Witnesses described debris that could not be burnt, bent, or cut with tools known at the time. The legend of Roswell was reborn. Skeptics responded with their own explanations. In the 1990s, the U.S. Air Force released reports stating that the debris came from Project Mogul, a classified program using high-altitude balloons to detect Soviet nuclear tests. Because the project was secret in 1947, officials argued, it was easier to label the wreckage a weather balloon. As for the results of alien bodies, the Air Force suggested they were likely anthropomorphic test dummies used in later experiments. Critics countered that test dummies were not used until years after 1947. What makes Roswell unique is not just the claims, but the contradictions. Official explanations changed more than once. Witnesses came forward decades later, often at personal cost. And no single narrative has fully explained every detail. Was Roswell the crash of an alien spacecraft? A Cold War secret misunderstood by the public? Or a myth built from secrecy, fear, and the power of storytelling? Whatever the truth, Roswell changed everything. It transformed flying saucers from fleeting sightings into a permanent part of American culture. It planted the idea that the government might know more than it says. And it ensured that whenever strange lights appear in the sky, one word is never far behind. Roswell. More than 70 years later, the desert keeps its secrets, and the question remains, was it merely debris from the dawn of the Cold War? Or evidence that for a brief moment in 1947, humanity was not alone? Thanks so much for being with me. I hope you've enjoyed our very first video on the Cool Topics channel. Again, just a quick reminder, please hit that subscribe button so that we can get recognized and get on the YouTube algorithm and get our, our YouTube topic videos shared really, really quickly. Thanks so much for being with me. We'll see you next time.